The horse had been dead for 2 days. Caleb Stone knew this from the smell which reached him a full quarter-mile before he saw anything carried on the flat morning air of the Copper Flats, with the particular certainty of a thing that does not require confirmation. He had been riding since before dawn, pushing east along the freight road, because he had nowhere particular to be, and a general direction was enough for a man who had stopped keeping appointments with the future. The sky above the Sonoran was the pale, washed-out blue of early June, the kind of sky that promises heat as surely as a banker promises repayment, and the saguaros stood in their rows on the low hills like sentinels who had run out of things to guard. He smelled the horse and turned Dusty off the road anyway. He did not know why. Habit may be the habit of a man who had ridden this country long enough to know that dead horses in the middle of nowhere were rarely just dead horses. Or something else, something less articulable, the specific gravity of a situation that pulls a person toward it before the reasoning mind has finished constructing its objections. He gave Dusty his head and let the animal pick its way down the shallow wash and up the other side through a stand of ocotillo that rattled in the small wind, and then around a low outcropping of pale limestone that smelled of old water. Behind the rock and the narrow strip of shade that the morning had not yet burned away, there was a child. She was 8 years old or thereabouts, small and brown from the sun, sitting with her back against the dead horse's flank in the manner of a person who has thought this through and arrived at the most practical arrangement available. The horse, a roan gelding with good conformation and a broken foreleg that had been wrapped in cloth and then given out anyway on the second day, lay on its side with the resigned finality of a large animal that has stopped fighting its situation. The child beside it had not stopped fighting. She had a canteen in her lap with the cap off and her hands around it, and the canteen was empty, and she held it anyway with the focused intentionality of someone for whom giving it up would mean accepting something she was not yet prepared to accept. She looked up at Caleb when he came around the rock, and she did not flinch, and she did not cry, and she did not call out. She looked at him the way an 8-year-old child looks at the world when 8 years of the world has taught her that the appropriate response to an unknown adult is careful observation rather than immediate trust. Her eyes were pale blue in her sun-darkened face, and they were entirely steady. "Are you going to help me or not?" she said. Caleb Stone had been asked many questions in his 35 years on this earth, and he could not recall another one that had cut to the matter with quite that efficiency. He swung down from Dusty and tied the horse to a mesquite branch and crouched in front of the child at the level where looking at her did not require her to look up. "That depends," he said. "What do you need?" "Water first. Then I need to get to a ranch called Willow Creek, about 18 miles north and east of here." "Do you know it?" "I know it. Henry Marsh's place." Something moved in the child's face at the name, a flicker of recognition and relief so quickly controlled that he almost missed it. She had been trained to control her responses, he realized. Not trained the way children are sometimes trained, harshly and with consequence, but trained the way children learn when training is necessary for survival, from a parent who had explained what was at stake and trusted the child to understand. He gave her his canteen. She drank 3 precise sips, tipped it back, pressed the stopper in, and held it out to him. He pushed it back toward her. "Take what you need. 3 sips every 2 hours is the right amount." "My mama told me." She said panic drinking is how people die when they think they're saved. She considered. "I've had 3 already. You might need it." He looked at this child for a long moment. 8 years old, alone in the Copper Flats with a dead horse and an empty canteen rationing water by the count, in 95-degree heat, maintaining a discipline that many grown men in this country could not sustain. He thought about what kind of mother produces a child like this, and the answer shaped itself in his mind with an uncomfortable precision before he had time to avoid it. The kind of mother who has spent years preparing her child for exactly this eventuality. The kind of mother who has been living in the expectation of catastrophe long enough to make sure her daughter knew what to do when it arrived. "What's your name?" he said. "Lily." "Lily what?" A pause, brief, controlled. "Lily Holt. Where's your mother, Lily Holt?" The pause this time was longer. Whatever she was deciding behind those steady blue eyes required more calculation than the name had. "She got hurt," she said finally. 3 weeks ago, men came to our camp. She made me leave. She put me on Biscuit and said ride east and don't stop until you reach the freight road, and then follow the road north and someone good would find me." She looked at the dead horse. Biscuit ran hard for 2 days. His leg gave out yesterday morning. I didn't leave him until he was gone. Caleb looked at the horse. The wrapped leg, the careful bandaging on a wound that could not be saved, but that someone had tried to save anyway. The canteen rigged from a water skin, the supplies distributed in a saddlebag, with the systematic logic of someone who had packed them, knowing the journey would be long and unpredictable. He looked at all of this, and he felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been sitting in approximately the same position for 8 years and was suddenly and without warning somewhere else. He had known a woman named Clara Holt once, the way you know people in a county with not enough people to divide cleanly into strangers and acquaintances. He had known her husband Robert more clearly, a school teacher at the old Copper Creek Church who read to anyone who wanted to listen on Sunday afternoons, and who had a way of treating people's questions as the most important questions ever asked. He had known them both in the autumn of 1871, when he was 27 years old, and living on his father's ranch and telling himself that whatever was coming was not his business. In October of 1871, the Holt house had burned. He had known it was coming. He had known the way cowards know things with complete certainty and absolute inaction, standing at a sufficient distance from the event to maintain the fiction that distance constituted innocence. Robert Holt had died in that fire. Eleanor Holt had died in that fire. And Clara Holt, who had been 20 years old and 8 months along with a child who had not yet been born, had disappeared into the Arizona wilderness and never come back, which Caleb had told himself over the years meant that she had gotten away, which was not the same as safe, but was better than the alternative. He looked at Lily's pale blue eyes, Robert Holt's eyes. He felt the full weight of 8 years land on him in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Come on," he said, and his voice was steady because he had decided it would be steady, which was perhaps the only useful thing he had learned in 35 years of living. "We'll get you up on Dusty and ride to Willow Creek." He lifted her onto the horse and swung up behind her and turned north, and he did not look back at the dead roan gelding with the wrapped leg lying in the shadow of the limestone outcropping. But he carried the image of it nonetheless, the image of a mother's preparation and a child's survival, and the particular kind of love that makes a person capable of sending away the thing they love most, because sending it away is the only way to keep it alive. They rode. Lily said very little in the first hours, which Caleb respected and did not attempt to fill. She sat in front of him on Dusty with the upright posture of a child accustomed to long hours in the saddle and the particular containment of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible, physical and otherwise. The sun climbed and the heat built, and the country rolled past them in its indifferent beige immensity, and around midday they stopped at a seep spring under a cottonwood and let Dusty drink and ate the corn cake that Caleb had in his saddlebag, divided with the wordless precision of two people who understood that the division was equal. "You know Henry Marsh," she said. It was not a question. "I worked his ranch for 2 summers about 10 years ago. Good man. Mama said he was the one person who could be trusted. She said he knew my father. She said he was the only one who kept the letter." Caleb looked at her sideways. "What letter?" Lily pressed her lips together in a gesture he was already beginning to recognize as her specific variety of being careful about what she said and to whom. "A letter my grandfather wrote," she said, "before he died. Mama said it was the most important thing in the world and that Mr. Marsh had kept it all these years because he is the kind of man who keeps things." They reached Willow Creek Ranch in the late afternoon when the light had gone amber and long, and the valley below the cottonwoods was cool for the first time since dawn. Henry Marsh came out of the house before they had crossed the yard, which meant he had seen them coming from some distance, and had decided in whatever calculation old men run in such situations that the horse with 2 riders warranted coming out. He was 70 years old, and he moved across his own yard with the unhurried purpose of a man who had been in enough situations to know that hurrying was rarely the solution it pretended to be. He saw Lily and stopped. He stood in the yard with his hands loose at his sides and his white eyebrows together, and a look on his face that was not surprise exactly, but something more specific than surprise. The look of a man who has been keeping faith with something for a very long time and has just received word that the keeping was not wasted. "You are Clara's child," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir. My name is Lily. Mama sent me." Henry looked at Caleb over Lily's head with a question in the look that was too complex for a single glance to carry, but whose general direction was unmistakable. "Found her at Copper Flats," Caleb said, 2 days out from her mother's last position. Clara was hurt. Men came to their camp. Henry closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and became very practical, the way old men who have survived difficulty become practical. because practicality is the only useful response to information that cannot be changed. Come inside, he said, both of you. The house was low-ceilinged and clean-smelling of pine resin and lamp oil and decades of decent living. Henry fed Lily first hot soup and cornbread and watched her eat with the silent attention of someone cataloging the specific damage that deprivation leaves on a body. Lily ate with the controlled discipline she applied to everything, not rushing, chewing carefully, drinking water in measured amounts. When she was done, she looked at Henry with those pale blue eyes and said, "Mama told me you have a letter." Henry looked at Caleb. Then he went to the fireplace and removed a stone from the left side of the hearth, reaching into the space behind it and bringing out an oilskin packet sealed with candle wax that had been resealed multiple times over the years. Each sealing slightly different from the last, evidence of a man who had opened it occasionally to confirm that it was still there and still intact and then put it back. He set it on the table. "Robert Holt gave me this letter in September of 1871, he said, 6 weeks before the fire. He told me he did not know whether he would need me to use it or not. He said if he and Eleanor were both gone and Clara was gone and no one came to me in 5 years, I should burn it, because a truth with no one left to receive it is just a risk. But he also said that if anyone from his family ever came to this house, I should give it to them and help them in every way I could." He looked at the packet. "I have opened it 11 times in 8 years. I have come close to burning it twice. I am glad I did not." He pushed the oilskin packet across the table. Lily touched it. She did not open it immediately. She pressed her palm flat against it the way you press your palm against something you need to feel before you can believe it is real. Then she looked up at Henry. "What does it say?" "It says everything. It says what Warren Cole did during the war. It says why he burned the house. It says where your grandfather hid the evidence. It says that the truth does not die. It says that it waits." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was the most honest man I have ever known. And he was very afraid when he wrote that letter, but he was not afraid in the way that fear makes men small. He was afraid in the way that fear makes some men very precise." Caleb had not moved from his position near the door. He stood with his hands in his pockets and the feeling in his chest that had started in the copper flats and had been building steadily since the feeling of a debt coming, due a reckoning he had deferred for 8 years, arriving with the quiet inevitability of things that have been waiting patiently for their moment. "What did Cole do?" he said. Henry looked at him steadily. "In 1864, near the end of the war, Warren Cole commanded a detachment at a Union supply depot in the Western Territory. He burned that depot and killed 12 soldiers. He told the Army it was Confederate raiders. He took $40,000 in government gold and buried most of it and distributed the rest in ways that bought him protection for years afterward. Robert was a contract clerk at the depot. He was the only man who survived the fire, and he survived it by accident by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which turned out to be the right place at the right time, which is how these things sometimes work." He paused. "Robert testified before a military tribunal. Cole was dishonorably discharged. The case was sealed. Cole disappeared west and rebuilt himself as something untouchable. He became the law in this county specifically because being the law meant controlling what the law could see and what it could not." The room was quiet. Caleb thought about Warren Cole, who had been the marshal of Silver Mesa for as long as Caleb could remember being aware of such things. A large man in his 60s with a quality of dangerous pleasantness about him, the kind of man who smiled in ways that were technically smiles, but whose warmth did not reach the eyes. A man whose authority in the county was so complete and so long established that questioning it had come to seem not merely futile but somehow impolite, the social equivalent of questioning the weather. He thought about Robert Holt writing his letter in the lamplight of a September evening, knowing what was coming and setting down the truth in ink, because he had decided that the truth was worth setting down, even if he was not going to be alive to see it received. He thought about himself at 27 years old, hearing the horses in the night and lying in his bed and not getting up. "We need to get to Silver Mesa," he said. "We need to get there before Cole knows Lily is alive and headed for this ranch." Henry looked at him. Then Henry looked at the table between them, at the oilskin packet and the bowl Lily had eaten from and the lamp burning its quiet light. "I know a way to do this," Henry said, "but I need to bring 2 other men into it. Men I trust with my life." He paused. "I need to know if you're willing to stand in this, Caleb. Not as a favor, not as a temporary thing. To the end of it." Caleb looked at Lily, who was watching him with those pale blue eyes. "I'm in," he said. In the morning before they left for Silver Mesa, Lily came to Caleb on the porch where he was checking Dusty's shoes. She was carrying something in her closed fist, and she held it out to him without preamble. It was a bracelet made of horsehair, braided tightly, and finished with two small copper plates. On the inside of each plate, a letter was stamped, the letters pressed deep into the copper with a nail or a chisel, the work of someone who had no proper tools but whose intention had made the imprecision irrelevant. Hope, Lviv. Mama made it, Lily said. She made one for her and one for me. So we would remember when we were apart that the other one was still out there. She looked at the bracelet in his palm. I want you to have mine. Caleb looked at her. I can't take your mother's gift, he said. It's mine to give. And I'm giving it to you because I need you to keep your promise. Her voice was steady and direct in the way of someone who has thought this through completely and is not asking for discussion. You said you'd find her. Keep the bracelet until you do. Then give it back when you bring her home. He closed his hand around the bracelet. I'll find her, he said. I promise you that. She nodded once, turned and went back inside in the manner of someone who has concluded her business and trusts that business concluded. He put the bracelet in his shirt pocket close to his chest. They left for Silver Mesa at first light. The town sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges, the buildings strung out along a single main street with the casual permanence of structures that had expected to be temporary and then stayed anyway. The church at the north end, the general store and the marshal's office facing each other across the width of the street, like men who have had words but not yet come to blows. The courthouse behind the church with its painted sign, the houses and the corrals and the water trough and all the ordinary infrastructure of a community that had learned to live with its own silence. Lawson's general store smelled of leather and tobacco, and the particular combination of hardware and foodstuffs that was the smell of frontier commerce in the last years before the railroad reached everywhere. George Lawson himself was behind the counter, a large, quiet man of 55, who received customers with the dignified neutrality of someone who had decided long ago that his job was to provide goods without judgment, which was a reasonable position that required in practice a great deal more judgment than it appeared. They had been in the store perhaps 10 minutes, Caleb gathering supplies from the shelves, while Henry and Lily waited near the door when Warren Cole came in. He came in and he entered all spaces with the easy authority of a man who has spent decades being the largest thing in every room, the door swinging wide to accommodate him and staying open as if it understood its function. He was large Cole, not in the way of fat, but in the way of an animal that has been in its prime for a long time and shows no immediate sign of departing it. His hair was silver white, and his face had the mahogany finish of 60 years of Arizona sun, and his eyes, when they found Caleb and Lily and Henry near the door of the store, were gray and entirely still. The kind of still that water gets before the bottom drops out. Henry, Cole said, the pleasant voice, the voice of a man who had been using pleasantness as a weapon for 40 years. Didn't expect to find you in town on a Tuesday, and who's this young lady? He looked at Lily. Caleb watched Cole's face at the moment of recognition. It was a fraction of a second, a shift in the gray eyes so swift and controlled that only someone watching for it would have caught it, but Caleb was watching for it, and he caught it. The calculation that happened in that fraction of a second was visible like lightning in a dark sky, instantaneous and total. Identifying the child, identifying what her presence here meant, identifying the threat, and beginning to construct its response. All of it accomplished before the pleasant expression had time to falter. This was the man who had killed Robert and Eleanor Holt. Not in anger, in calculation. This was the face of someone who killed the way accountants complete columns, because the numbers came out that way. She's my granddaughter, Henry said. Come to visit for the summer. Is that right? Cole smiled at Lily. The smile was perfect. And what's your name, young lady? Lily looked at Warren Cole for a long and precisely measured moment. She looked at the man who had ordered the death of her grandparents and had spent 8 years hunting her mother. And she met his gray eyes with her pale blue ones, and her face showed nothing at all. Rose, she said, Rose Marsh. Cole held his smile for 3 more seconds. Then he tilted his hat brim and said he hoped they'd enjoy their visit to Silver Mesa, and he had a good day to attend to, and he walked back out the door with the unhurried gait of a man who has all the time in the world. The door closed behind him. George Lawson, behind the counter, had not moved for the last 2 minutes. He stood with his hands flat on the wood and his face careful and still, and when the door closed, he let out a breath that he appeared to have been holding since Cole walked in. Caleb finished packing the supplies without speaking. Lily stood near the door looking at the space where Cole had been with an expression that was not fear, he realized, but the specific focused attention of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis they have been testing for 8 years. Outside, Cole was crossing the street to his office. He did not look back. Men who are certain of their power rarely look back because looking back implies doubt. But he had sent one of his men to the livery within 2 minutes of leaving the store. Caleb saw this from the corner of his eye as they loaded the wagon. The man rode out of town headed south, and Caleb knew with the cold certainty of someone reading a situation whose grammar he recognized that Cole was already moving pieces, already sending word to Nathan Price and whoever else was stationed in the territory watching for exactly this kind of news. They had less time than he had calculated. That evening back at Willow Creek, Henry sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table with Robert Holt's letter laid open between them. Lily had gone to sleep in the small room off the kitchen, and the sound of her breathing through the partly open door was the only other sound in the house beside the lamp flame and the night insects outside. The letter was long, written in the dense, precise hand of a man with a lot of information and limited time, and no inclination to be careless with either. Henry had read it so many times he knew it from memory, but reading it in sequence with Caleb brought out new dimensions, the dimensions that required a witness. Cole had not acted alone in the burning. He had used 4 men from his own detachment, men who owed him for reasons Robert had documented with the specificity of a clerk, aims and debts, and the nature of the arrangement. 3 of those men were dead. One, a man then called Nathan Cord, had changed his name and now rode under the name Nathan Price. He was young, early 20s, working for Cole in the capacity of a man who knew too much to leave and not enough to threaten, which was the most dangerous kind of dependent. The evidence was physical, not merely testimonial. Robert had copied Cole's own hand-drawn map showing the burial location of the gold, a map that had been submitted to the military tribunal and then sealed along with the rest of the case. He had kept the copy. He had hidden the copy along with the surviving court documents he had retained as a clerk in a private letter from the presiding judge, confirming the substance of the verdict in a space beneath the floorboards of the old Copper Creek Church. The church that Cole had burned in 1871 as part of his destruction of the Holt family had been the meeting house and the primary building of the settlement, but not the stone church itself, which still stood at the edge of the burned settlement on the south side of Copper Creek, disused and half forgotten. The evidence was there. It had been there for 8 years. Waiting as Robert had written it would wait with the patience of truth that has been properly committed to a permanent record. Caleb read the last paragraph of the letter twice. I do not know whether this letter will reach anyone who can use it. I write it anyway because the truth requires a record, even when the record's audience is uncertain. The truth does not die. It waits. And it waits not in paper, but in people, in the people who carry it forward one generation to the next, in my daughter, and in the daughter she carries, and in every person who reads these words and decides that what I have written here is worth the risk of acting on. I trust that person exists. I have always trusted that. It is not optimism. It is knowledge of human beings at their best, which I have been privileged to witness enough times to know that it is real. Robert Holt, October 3rd, 1871. Caleb folded the letter carefully and looked up at Henry. What do you need me to do? He said. Henry looked at him across the table with the expression of a man reading something in another man's face that he has been waiting a long time to read there. I need you to help me bring 3 men together, Henry said, men who will not flinch from this. And then I need you to go find Clara Holt and bring her back because without her, this cannot be what it needs to be. Where is she? Devil's Ridge North Face. She's been running the Ridge country since Cole's men got to her camp 3 weeks ago. She's hurt and she is alone. He paused. Or I believed she was alone. But Clara Holt has survived 8 years in this territory with a child, which means she has resources we don't know about. She may have found help. She is a remarkable woman. From the small room, Lily's voice came through the door, quiet and certain as a compass needle. She always finds help, Lily said. Mama always finds a way. Caleb put his hand in his shirt pocket and felt the copper bracelet, the 2 words pressed deep into the metal. He sat at that table in the lamplight with Henry Marsh and the letter of a dead man and the sound of a sleeping child, and he made the decision that he should have made 8 years ago on a night when he heard horses in the dark and chose to stay in his bed. He would not stay in bed again. Outside in the dark country south of Willow Creek, a rider pushed his horse towards Silver Mesa with news for Warren Cole. The night was clear and full of stars and entirely indifferent to the events being set in motion beneath it, which was appropriate because the stars had been there before all of this and would be there long after. And what mattered was not their attention, but the character of the people moving in their light. Caleb Stone extinguished the lamp and went to sleep on Henry's porch with his rifle across his lap, and he slept better than he had slept in 8 years. The debt was finally being paid. The messages went out at sunset carried by two riders Henry had trusted for decades, men who had worked his land since they were young and whose discretion had been tested over the years in smaller ways and found reliable. One rider went north toward the canyon country where Owen Fletcher ran cattle on a leased spread. The other went south into Silver Mesa itself to a white-painted house behind the church where Reverend James Webb had lived for 20 years. Henry wrote nothing down. The messages were spoken simple and exact. Come tonight. Come armed. Come alone. Caleb sat on the porch while Henry put Lily to bed. The Arizona night came down with its characteristic decisiveness, the heat of the day lifting all at once, and the temperature dropping 20 degrees in the space of half an hour, the stars arriving in their hundreds and then their thousands until the sky was more light than dark. He had grown up under these stars. He had spent 35 years looking at them from various porches and campsites in hillside perches without ever finding what he was looking for. And tonight he understood for the first time that what he had been looking for was not something the stars could provide. It was something he had to make himself. He thought about Robert Holt. He had known Robert slightly in the ordinary way of a county with not enough people. He had bought seed corn from him, once seen him teach through an open church window, once watched him stop to help a stranger fix a wagon wheel on the freight road, once all of it cataloged in the peripheral vision of a man who had not been paying sufficient attention. He had been a quiet man, Robert Holt. Not quiet from timidity, but quiet from concentration. The specific quiet of someone who was always listening more carefully than he was speaking, and whose words, when he did speak, carried the compacted weight of genuine thought. He had died trusting that somewhere in this county there was a person who would eventually do the right thing. Caleb hoped with a feeling that was not quite prayer and not quite determination, but something made of both, that he was not too late to honor that trust. Owen Fletcher arrived just after full dark, his horse moving through the cottonwoods without sound, because Owen moved through all environments without unnecessary sound, which was a quality he had developed over years of working alone in country where drawing attention could be consequential. He was 35, the same age as Caleb, lean and dark-eyed and possessed of a quality of stillness that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for slowness until they watched him work. He could put 3 rounds through a playing card at 50 yards with the unhurried precision of a man for whom accuracy was a professional standard and not a matter of pride. He came through the door and looked past Caleb to the room where Lily was sleeping, visible through the partly open door, small and exhausted in the narrow bed. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "Clara Holt's daughter found her in Copper Flats this morning with a dead horse and an empty canteen." Caleb kept his voice level. "She'd been out there 3 days. Rationed her water to the hour, 8 years old." Owen was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of silence that meant he was absorbing something important and giving it the weight it was due. "Clara's up on Devil's Ridge, hurt. Cole's men found her camp 3 weeks ago." Owen looked at Caleb for a long moment. He did not ask whether Caleb was certain. He did not ask whether this was wise. He did not ask any of the questions that a cautious man with a comfortable life might reasonably ask when invited into a situation that could get him killed. He asked the only question that mattered to him. "What do you need?" Reverend James Webb arrived an hour later. He was 61 years old, white-haired, and slightly bowed at the shoulders in the manner of a man who had spent decades bending toward people who needed help. His hands were steady, his eyes were clear. He had been a military chaplain during the war, the kind of chaplain who walked toward artillery because that was where his function was required, and he had carried that particular orientation toward difficulty through the 20 years since without losing it. He could pray and he could fight, and he understood them to be complementary skills rather than opposing ones, both demanding the same fundamental willingness to be present where presence was costly. When Henry laid Robert Holt's letter on the table, Webb read it twice without speaking. Then he held it with both hands, for a moment the paper between his fingers, as if the physical substance of the thing required steadying. "God forgive us all," he said. Henry poured coffee. 4 men sat around the table in the lamplight with the maps and the letter, and the leather satchel of implications laid open between them, and they talked through the night. Caleb laid it out. 3 missions simultaneous because sequential was too slow and Cole was already moving. He and Owen would ride north to Devil's Ridge at first light to find Clara. Webb would go to the old church at Copper Creek for the evidence hidden in the floorboards. Henry would stay at the ranch with Lily as the fixed point around which everything else oriented. The church will be watched, Webb said. Which is why you are the right man to go, Caleb said. A reverend walking into a church is not a suspicious event. Cole may hesitate before he starts shooting near a house of God in plain daylight. May. That word is doing a lot of work in this plan. Webb was quiet for a moment in the way of someone conducting an internal audit that only he could hear. I was at Chickamauga, he said finally. I have stood in places where the argument for hesitation was considerably stronger than it is here. He picked up his coffee cup. I'll go to the church. Owen said nothing. He was memorizing the map with the focused attention of someone who needed to know the terrain the way he knew his own hands. Henry looked across at the table at Caleb with the look of a man who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between someone who talks about doing right and someone who does it and who is taking the final measurement now. When my wife died, Henry said not to anyone in particular, just to the room to the lamp and the night outside the window. Robert Holt came to this house every day for 2 weeks. He did not ask if I needed anything. He just came, fixed a fence, brought firewood, sat with me in the evenings without filling the silence with noise. He paused. That is the only kind of man whose death you do not get over. The kind who treated you like you were worth the trouble. No one responded because there was nothing to add to that. Owen put his hand flat on the table. Webb placed his on top of it. Henry reached across and added the scarred and deliberate hand of 70 years of honest labor. Caleb looked at the 3 hands on the table. He placed his on top. 4 men, none of them under any illusion that what they were planning was safe or certain or guaranteed to end in any particular way. All of them present, all of them decided. They moved before dawn. The country north of Henry's Valley changed fast. Flat grazing land gave way within 3 miles to broken rock and dry arroyos, the earth fracturing and heaving as the elevation rose, the heat reflecting off pale limestone in the morning light until the distances shimmered. Caleb and Owen rode without talking, conserving the horses, each man scanning his half of the visible landscape in the automatic way of people who have spent their lives reading country for danger and opportunity simultaneously. Devil's Ridge rose ahead of them like a rampart, 15 miles of fractured limestone, thrown along a fault line, the north face holding shadow into the morning, and water in its crevices, and the kind of concealment that a person who needed all 3 things would be drawn to as a matter of simple survival logic. They found the first sign an hour into the ridge country, a scrap of blue cotton caught on a mesquite branch at shoulder height, the fabric stiff but not old. Owen dismounted and examined it without touching it. 3 days, maybe 4. Someone moving in a hurry. They followed the trail. More signs appeared at irregular intervals, each one individually explicable as coincidence and collectively too consistent to be accidental. A boot print in wind-sheltered sand. A place on a boulder where someone had rested their back, leaving a faint compression in the dust, shaped like human shoulders. The involuntary record of a person passing through. Then they found the blood. It had dried dark on pale limestone, a scattering of drops in one small pool where someone had stopped and stood long enough to collect themselves before moving on. Not much. But blood in the desert told its own arithmetic, and the arithmetic was that the person bleeding had been doing so for a long time and was still moving, which was either a testament to their constitution or an indictment of their situation, or both. She's been hurt since the camp attack, Caleb said. 3 weeks of this. But she's thinking, Owen said, crouching beside a set of footprints in the sand between 2 rocks. Look at the spacing. She's not dragging. She's tired and she's in pain, but she's picking her feet up, placing them deliberately, conserving every step. He looked up toward the ridge. She knows what she's doing. Caleb thought of Lily beside the dead horse with her empty canteen rationing water by the count. Smart ran in this family deep and functional, the kind of intelligence that had been forged in circumstances that leave no room for the decorative variety. They climbed. The cave was on the north face, hidden behind a collapse of boulders that formed a natural barrier, visible from neither below nor from either side. Owen found it because of a single detail that did not belong to the landscape, a strip of cloth stretched across the opening and anchored at the corners with small stones creating shade that was too deliberate to be accidental. Caleb tied Dusty back and walked toward the opening with his hands visible, moving slowly. Clara Holt, my name is Caleb Stone. I found your daughter in Copper Flats 3 days ago. She is safe with Henry Marsh. The silence that followed had a quality of attention in it, the silence of someone listening with everything they had. Then a voice came from inside the cave, weak in volume but not in intention. Come any closer, and I'll shoot. I'm coming in slow, no weapons in my hands. He pushed the cloth aside and stepped in. The cave was cool and dim, perhaps 12 feet deep, wide enough for two people without touching. His eyes adjusted. Two figures resolved out of the shadows. Clara Holt sat propped against the back wall with a pistol in her right hand. She was thin in the way that years of necessity makes a person thin, not from illness, but from the sustained burning of reserves that are never fully replenished. Her dark hair hung loose around a face that had once been beautiful and was now something beyond beautiful, the way a blade is beyond the ore. It came from every unnecessary thing, removed by 8 years of hard use until what remained was pure function and pure character. Her left shoulder was wrapped in bandaging made from torn cloth, the outer layers dark with old blood, and the inner layers damp with newer blood beneath. Her eyes, pale blue in the dimness, were focused and entirely alert. Robert Holt's eyes. Beside Clara sat someone Caleb had not anticipated. A woman Apache, perhaps 55 years old, with the high cheekbones and the straight back of someone whose posture had been formed by a lifetime close to the ground and the wind. She wore a buckskin skirt and a cotton blouse faded from long washing, and she held a knife in her right hand with the casual readiness of someone for whom a blade was a working implement used for everything and threatening in nothing until it needed to be threatening. On her left wrist, a silver bracelet engraved with a hawk in flight. Her eyes found Caleb and assessed him with the complete and unhurried competence of a woman who had been reading the true character of human beings in difficult situations for half a century. The pistol had not moved. Where is my daughter? Clara's voice was controlled. The control was not coldness. It was 8 years of training herself not to hope until hope was warranted. Caleb reached into his shirt pocket, slowly giving both women every second they needed to track the movement. He brought out the horsehair bracelet and held it up between two fingers. Hope lives. The pistol came down. Clara closed her eyes. The expression that crossed her face in the following seconds was too complex to name 8 years of fear and isolation, and the specific grief of a woman who has been holding herself together by will alone colliding with the first evidence she had received in all that time that the holding together had been worth something. When she opened her eyes, there were tears on her face and she did not move to wipe them. Is she truly safe? She asked. She's with Henry, eating hot meals, sleeping in a real bed. She rode her horse until he fell, and then she kept herself alive for 3 days in the shade, waiting for someone to come. He paused. She rationed her water to 3 sips every 2 hours. She said you taught her that. Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. She asked me to tell you she was brave, Caleb said. That she didn't cry. The Apache woman placed her hand on Clara's shoulder. Then she turned to look at Caleb and assessed him with those dark eyes for a long moment, measuring something that he could not see but could feel the weight of. I am Ruth Clearwater, she said. Her voice was low and level, the voice of someone who had long since finished with the performance of any emotion and spoke only from the bedrock of actual experience. I have watched over this woman for 3 months. Caleb looked at her. Why? He asked it directly because the situation required directness, and because he already suspected that Ruth Clearwater had no patience for the alternative. She appeared to confirm this by the slight change in her expression, a fractional opening that might have been approval of the question. Because Warren Cole burned my village in the summer of 1867, she said. He said we were sheltering enemies of the territory. This was a lie told to justify what he intended regardless of any truth. He killed my husband while he was carrying water from the creek. He killed my older son, who was 22 years old and had never raised a hand against any living person outside of necessity. He killed my younger son, who was 14 and who was running to get the children away from the fire when Cole's men found him. She spoke without trembling and without the performance of grief. She had said these words so many times in her own mind that the saying of them had become a form of precision rather than a form of pain. I have waited 12 years for the right moment. This woman and her daughter and the proof her father left behind are the right moment. I have kept her alive because dead women cannot testify, and dead children cannot grow up to see justice done. She stopped. Then she added with the most restrained form of bitterness Caleb had ever heard. I have also kept her alive because she is a good woman who did not deserve what was done to her family, and because her daughter deserves to know her mother. These are also sufficient reasons. From above, outside the cave, Owen's voice came down sharp and close. 3 riders from the south. Coming fast. Less than a mile. Ruth was on her feet before the sentence was finished, assembling her pack with the economy of motion of someone who has been ready to move on short notice for 12 years. 30 seconds and it was done. Clara tried to stand. Her shoulder caught her. The whitening of her knuckles and the set of her jaw told Caleb everything about how much this cost her, but she made no sound. Can you ride? I can do whatever I have to do to see my daughter. That has always been the answer to that question. He helped her out of the cave. They reached the horses as the first shot came from above them, the crack of a rifle, and the impact of a bullet in the rock face 3 feet to Caleb's left. Cole's men had been watching the ridge. Cole had anticipated the direction they might come from, which meant Cole had calculated the possibilities overnight and deployed accordingly, which was the action of a man who was not panicking but thinking, which made him more dangerous than a panicking man, not less. Caleb got Clara onto Dusty in front of him and turned the horse downhill, moving fast, the loose rock rattling under the hooves in the irregular percussion of a mountain descent that was more controlled fall than riding. Clara held the saddle horn with her right hand and leaned into him without instruction, distributing her weight with the unconscious competence of a woman who had spent years on horseback and understood the geometry of well, shit. Owen had Ruth behind him already and was moving. More shots. A round came close enough to Caleb's ear that he heard the passage of it, which focuses the attention in a way that nothing else quite duplicates. He pressed low over Dusty's neck and let the horse find its own footing and its speed, trusting the animal's judgment over his own capacity to direct it in this terrain at this pace. Owen led them through a narrow cut in the rock that Caleb would never have found alone, up a switchback that doubled back on itself, gaining elevation briefly before dropping down the far side of a secondary ridge and putting a wall of stone between them and the pursuit. By the time they reached the floor of the valley south of Devil's Ridge, the sound of following hooves had gone quiet. They did not stop until the cottonwoods along Copper Creek came into view. Clara came off Dusty's back and nearly went down. Caleb caught her and held her upright for a moment while she found her feet, and he felt in the thinness of her arm under his hands the physical record of 8 years of everything she had endured and refused to be destroyed by. Ruth was already on one knee, her pack open beside her. She cleaned and repacked the shoulder wound with herbs from her kit and the competent efficiency of someone who had been doctoring people in the field for decades. And the wound revealed itself under her hands as a through and through that had been healing from the outside while becoming more complicated within 3 weeks of movement and insufficient treatment, driving infection into the deep tissue. Clara sat through the process with the specific stillness of someone who has made peace with pain as a condition of existence rather than an interruption of it, and when Ruth had finished, she looked at Caleb with those pale blue eyes and said, "Tell me everything." He told her all of it, factually and completely, because he judged her to be a woman who wanted information rather than reassurance, and being right about this appeared to satisfy her in a way that reassurance would not have. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. "My father died protecting that truth," she said. "I will not let it be for nothing." Then Owen said, "There's something else." He said it in the quiet voice of a man delivering news he knows will complicate an already complicated situation, and he looked at Clara when he said it, and then at Caleb. "Nathan Price came to me this morning before we left Henry's. Said he had something to tell. Said he'd give us everything if we could keep him safe." Owen turned a stick in his hands, looking at it rather than the others, the way people sometimes look at something neutral when they are saying something heavy. He said Cole has not been working alone. Not just hired men, someone in a courthouse, someone with a title and a gavel who has made sure that every legal complaint against Cole in this county over the past 20 years has been quietly buried before it could grow into anything. Clara went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of confirmation, the stillness of a woman who had suspected something for years and is finally hearing it spoken aloud by someone who can name it. "Judge Harold Stanton," she said. The name sat in the air above the creek. Owen looked at her. "You knew?" "My father mentioned someone in his notes. No name, a description. Someone on the bench who received cases and returned verdicts that served one consistent interest. Someone whose record of dismissed complaints could not be explained by incompetence." She pressed her lips together. "Stanton has been Cole's insurance. Everything Cole could not resolve with a badge, Stanton resolved with a gavel. Together, they did not build a single corrupt official. They built a system, an environment in which the law itself was the weapon and reporting crimes was futile and dangerous simultaneously. She looked at the cottonwoods moving in the small wind. They made the silence look like the only rational choice, and then they used the silence to keep killing. Caleb sat with the full weight of that word. System, not a man but a structure. Corruption built into the load-bearing walls of the institution designed to be self-sustaining and self-protecting. They had not merely committed crimes. They had made the county into an environment where the crimes could not be seen. The reasonable silence had cost Robert and Eleanor Holt their lives. It had cost Ruth Clearwater, her husband and her sons. It had cost Clara 8 years in the wilderness and Lily 8 years of a childhood that a child should not have to live. It had cost Caleb 8 years of carrying something that should have been a wound and had instead calcified into something that looked from the outside like ordinary living. Nathan Price will testify to Stanton's involvement, he asked. He says he will. Says he has a letter. Cole's own hand naming Stanton and the arrangement between them dated 1876. Owen met Caleb's eyes. He says he has been holding it for 2 years, waiting for a moment when it would mean something instead of just getting him killed. Henry Marsh arrived from the south at a hard canter, his horse blowing and his face set in the expression of a man carrying urgent news and allowing himself to carry it no faster than riding will take it. He saw Clara and stopped his horse. He looked at her for one brief moment with something in his face that was a whole conversation conducted without words, the look of a man who has kept faith with someone for 8 years and is now looking at the evidence that the faith was not misplaced. Then he looked at Caleb. "We have a problem," he said. Webb went to the church. He found the hiding place and secured the evidence. But Cole had men inside the building, not watching from outside inside for weeks. It was a trap. Webb got a boy out through the back window with a message. He steadied his horse. Cole is at the church now. He has 8 men. He is going to burn it with Webb inside unless Webb tells him where the evidence is. Clara was on her feet. Her shoulder stopped her. She overrode it with the flat refusal of someone who has already decided what matters more. "The papers," she said. "If Webb hid them before Cole's men closed in, they are safe for now. But if Cole gets into that building and tears it apart while no one is watching, they will not stay safe." She looked at Caleb. "How long?" "Less than an hour before he loses patience," Henry said. Caleb was already moving toward the horses. The old church at Copper Creek had survived the fire that took the settlement around it in 1871, which was either irony or providence depending on how a person oriented towards such questions. The settlement was gone entirely now, nothing remaining but scorched foundation stones, half buried by 8 years of wind-blown sand, the geometry of a vanished community, visible only in the arrangement of what it had left behind. The church stood at the center of this absence, wood gone dark with age, and stone gone mossy in the places where moisture collected, a structure that had outlasted its congregation by a decade. Smoke rose from the dry grass to the east and south. Cole had set fires at the approaches, a slow encirclement that served 2 purposes. It reduced the angles from which he could be flanked, and it announced his presence and his intention in a way that was partly practical and partly the expression of a man who had always understood that the demonstration of power was often more useful than its application. He had set the fires with the confidence of someone who had spent 60 years making situations turn out the way he wanted them to turn out. 8 men deployed around the building, covering the windows and the single door. Cole himself stood at the entrance with one shoulder against the door frame in the posture of a man who has already written the ending of the story and is simply waiting for the narrative to catch up. "This is your last opportunity, preacher," he called into the church. Pleasant, reasonable, the voice of a man who regrets that things have come to this. "Tell me where you hid those papers, and I'll let you walk out of here. No harm to you. I have no quarrel with the church." From inside, Reverend James Webb's voice came back flat and clear, and carrying the particular calm of a man who has spent 20 years deciding what he believed and has recently had the occasion to find out whether he actually believed it. "I would rather burn like Robert and Eleanor Holt burned." Cole turned to the man with the torch. Caleb stood up from behind the boulder to the south. "Marshal," his voice carried across the open ground without difficulty, "those papers are already out of your reach. And every person you see here today is prepared to testify to everything they have witnessed. You want to end this? You'll have to come through all of us first." Cole turned slowly, He looked at Caleb and at the positions around him, and the calculation in his gray eyes was fast and complete. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who counted. Caleb Stone, he said, and the pleasantness in his voice acquired a new quality, the pleasantness of someone who has decided on a course of action and finds it agreeable. I wondered when you were going to make a decision. I made it 8 years ago, Caleb said. I'm correcting the error now. Then things happened very fast. From the east, Owen Fletcher's rifle fired once. One of Cole's men went down clutching his shoulder, his rifle in the dirt. From the west, Henry Marsh's shotgun fired both barrels, and the sound of it crossed the open ground like a door being slammed in a very large building, and 2 more of Cole's men discovered that standing upright was no longer their first priority. From the north, in the shadow of the old cemetery wall, an arrow crossed 30 yards of clear air and pinned the sleeve of the man holding the torch to the fence post behind him. The torch dropped, rolled, lay in the dirt and burned itself down to nothing against the bare earth, with nothing dry enough close by to catch. Ruth Clearwater lowered her bow and picked up a second arrow. Cole's men had been positioned for a threat that came from one direction or not at all. They were not positioned for simultaneous accurate fire from 4 quadrants delivered by people who knew exactly what they were doing. 2 men broke immediately and ran for their horses. 3 more dropped their weapons and raised their hands with the pragmatic speed of men who had just performed a rapid reassessment. The remaining 3 tried to find cover in positions that had been chosen without accounting for this geometry. Cole stepped back into the doorway of the church and used his pistol with the concentrated precision of a man who had been in firefights before and understood that the first requirement was not winning but not dying. He was accurate. A round came close enough to Caleb's head that he heard it pass, which is a sound that tends to reorder a person's priorities with considerable efficiency. He rolled behind a larger rock, came up at a different angle, and was calculating his next move when the situation inside the church produced its own resolution. The sound of something heavy and wooden connecting with something large and human came through the open doorway. Warren Cole came through the doorway face first, driven by a force applied to his upper back that propelled him out of the entrance and down the 3 steps and into the dirt of the churchyard, where he arrived with the convincing finality of a large man who has been given no say in the matter. The pistol left his hand on the second step. Reverend Pines-Webb appeared in the doorway behind him holding a heavy wooden cross in both hands, breathing hard with the expression of a man who has just done something he was fairly certain God would understand and was less certain the bishop would. Henry Marsh was standing over Cole before Cole could reconstruct his relationship with the horizontal. "Don't move," Henry said. He pressed the reloaded shotgun to the back of Cole's neck, and his voice was absolutely conversational. The voice of a man who has made peace with everything that follows from the action he is currently prepared to take. "I have survived 40 years since Antietam. One more will not trouble my sleep." Cole lay still. He lay in the dirt of the Copper Creek churchyard with his hands pinned under Henry Marsh's boot and his gray eyes moving in the only direction they still could, taking in Caleb and Owen and Ruth and Webb, calculating exits and finding none. He was not broken. Not yet. But the architecture of his confidence had suffered a structural event, and the man lying in the dirt of his own churchyard with a 70-year-old man's shotgun on his neck was operating with less certainty than the man who had ridden out that morning. Ruth moved through Cole's wounded men with her medicine pack. She checked injuries, applied pressure-bound wounds, worked with the same hands that had put the arrow through the sleeve of the man with the torch. Owen watched her do this without comment for a moment. Then he asked quietly, "Why?" Ruth did not look up from the dressing she was applying. "Because we are not what they are," she said. "We do what is right, not what is easy, not what feels satisfying." She tied off the bandage and moved to the next man. "Your enemies define the floor of your behavior only if you let them. I do not let them." Owen nodded once and held the next dressing steady while she worked. Webb came out of the church carrying the leather satchel. He looked, Caleb thought, like a man who had just conducted services under unusual conditions and found that the unusual conditions had not diminished the quality of the services. He handed the satchel to Clara, who had arrived at the edge of the churchyard on Owen's horse and dismounted despite her shoulder's vigorous objection. "Your father was meticulous," Webb said. "He documented everything. He trusted that someone would come and that the someone would know what to do with it." Clara received the satchel with both hands. She held it against her chest for a long moment, her eyes closed, and whatever happened in those few seconds was private, in the way that the most important things always are. Then she opened her eyes and her face had on it the expression of a woman who has found the last piece of the thing she was looking for and now understands fully what it means. We need to get Cole secured and reach town before his people in Silver Mesa understand what has happened, she said. Her voice was clear and practical, the voice of her father's daughter. Stanton will be the first thing Cole's allies move to protect. If Stanton disappears, half our case disappears with him. They bound Cole's hands and loaded him into one of his own men's wagons, which struck no one as ironic because no one had the time. The wounded men were secured with their injuries tended, and two of Henry's men left to watch over them. Ruth rode with Owen. Clara rode with Caleb, her right hand on the saddle horn and her injured shoulder held carefully, and her jaw set in the expression of someone who has permanently removed pain from the category of things that get to have a vote. They reached Willow Creek before dark. Cole went into the storm cellar with two guards Henry trusted. Everyone ate, drank water, and gathered around the kitchen table to plan the morning. That night, after the plans were made and the lamp turned low, Lily came out of her room and found her mother sitting by the fire. She did not run. She walked with the deliberate care of someone approaching something she needs, very much approaching it carefully so as not to break it or startle it away. She sat down beside Clara on the bench in front of the hearth and leaned against her, and Clara put her arm around her daughter, and neither of them said anything for a long while. The fire spoke for them. It said what needed to be said. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. Then he went outside because some things are not completed by witnesses. He was on the porch at 3 a.m. when the absence woke him. Not a sound. The absence of sounds that should have been there. The quiet voices of the guards at the cellar, the small shuffle of feet on dry ground. He was across the yard in 10 seconds. The cellar door hung open. One guard lay beside it, breathing but not conscious, with a lump behind his right ear that told the story plainly. The second guard was gone entirely. Cole was gone. Caleb stood in the open doorway of the empty cellar for 3 seconds and ran the calculation. Cole had not run. That was the first conclusion, and he arrived at it immediately because Cole was not a man who ran. Running required acknowledging defeat, and Cole had not acknowledged defeat in 60 years of building, manipulating, and destroying everything that stood in the way of what he wanted. Cole would go to Silver Mesa. He would go to his office and his weapons and the judge in the courthouse who had protected him for 20 years. He would reassemble his authority and come back with enough force to end the question, permanently burning the evidence and everyone who had seen it. Henry appeared from the house pulling on his coat. The second guard was Cole's, Henry said. The statement was both an admission and an assessment. I should have anticipated it. He's going to Silver Mesa. Caleb was already moving to the corral. If he reaches Stanton before we do, Stanton will help him burn everything we have. Henry looked at the sky with the precision of a man who has been navigating by stars for 50 years. 2 hours before dawn, we can match him if we leave now. Owen Fletcher was saddled before Caleb finished the sentence. They rode in the dark at the pace the horses could sustain the road to Silver Mesa, pale beneath them, and the cold of the desert night cutting clean through their coats. Clara rode beside Caleb with the reins in her right hand, her left arm held close to her body, her face set against the pain, with the absolute stubbornness of a woman who had been stubborn about staying alive for 8 years and had not used up her supply. They entered Silver Mesa as the first gray light touched the mountains to the east. The lamps were already burning in the marshal's office. Cole had beaten them by 20 minutes. Time enough in another calculation to reassemble the pieces of what had been a formidable machine 24 hours ago. But 20 minutes was not it, turned out enough time to undo what had already been set in motion. Because the news had traveled through Silver Mesa in the hours since the confrontation at Copper Creek, moving by the routes that news moves in small towns, through a boy who had been sent with a message and had talked in a kitchen before departing, through George Lawson's oldest daughter, who had seen something from her window the previous afternoon and had told her mother through the particular anxiety that had been building in this town for 8 years, like water rising behind a sealed door. The news had moved, and as it moved, something else had moved with it. Something that had been sitting motionless for 8 years had shifted. When Caleb and the others rode into the main street of Silver Mesa in the gray light before dawn, people were already standing on the sidewalks. George Lawson, 2 older ranchers, a young mother with her child against her shoulder, a farmer who had ridden 10 miles through the night after hearing something and deciding that whatever it was required him to be present. They stood in the way that ordinary people stand when they have decided that standing somewhere Matters not performing anything, just present, visible, choosing witness over absence. Cole came out of the marshal's office with his pistol drawn and his badge catching the first light. He looked at Caleb and the people with him. He looked at the faces on the sidewalks. He looked at Nathan Price standing beside Owen Fletcher, the young man who had ridden for him for 3 years now, standing in the opposite camp with the straight-back posture of someone who has made an irrevocable decision and is at peace with every consequence it carries. He understood what he was seeing. For the first time in this long day, something moved behind Warren Cole's controlled face that was not calculation. Something older and rawer than calculation, the thing that calculation exists to cover and suppress and keep from showing in the eyes of powerful men. "This is over, Warren," Caleb said. He walked forward steadily, his hands visible. "The evidence is secured and in multiple locations. The witnesses are here, and by morning everyone in this territory is going to hear every word of it." Cole raised his pistol with the deliberate movement of a man who has decided that the clean, direct application of force is still his best option. He did not complete the motion. Ruth Clearwater's arrow came from the shadow of a doorway across the street and drove through the sleeve of Cole's gun arm and into the wooden post behind him, pinning him to it with the precise economy of 12 years of patient waiting and 30 yards of clear morning air. The pistol dropped from his suddenly awkward hand and hit the dust of the main street of Silver Mesa. "I think not," Ruth said from the shadow. A second arrow was already on the string. Cole stood pinned to the post with his pistol in the dirt and looked at the people on the sidewalks, looking back at him. Across the face of the square, he could see them, all the ordinary residents of a town he had owned for 20 years, looking at him without the particular quality that had always defined their looking before. The quality of fear. The quality of a community that had learned to keep its eyes down and its questions unasked and its grievances private. That quality was gone. What had replaced it was something he had not expected and could not entirely account for because he had spent 40 years in the business of preventing it. What had replaced it was the way people look when they have stopped being afraid. Henry Marsh walked across the street with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of a man completing a task he has been assigned. He removed the arrow from Cole's sleeve with the efficient gesture of someone pulling a nail from a board and caught Cole's arm and bound his wrists with the rope he had brought for exactly this moment. Across the square, the door of the territorial courthouse opened. Judge Harold Stanton came out onto the front steps fully dressed in his black suit at an hour when no court was in session. He composed his face into the expression of a man who has complete confidence in the law and its processes, and is here to ensure they are properly followed. He had been awake all night, and he had spent the night preparing this expression, and it was a very good expression. It was the expression of 20 years of practice in presenting himself as an institution rather than a man. Then he saw Nathan Price. Nathan Price looked back at him without flinching. The expression held for 3 seconds. Then it did not hold anymore the way a wall holds until it doesn't, the internal structure having failed some time before the external form acknowledges it. Henry turned to face the people gathered in the street. He was 70 years old, and he had run cattle in this valley since before most of them were born, and he had made his share of mistakes in that time, and lived with the full weight of them in the way that honest people live with their mistakes, which is to say heavily, and without the comfort of revision. "Go home," he said to the gathering crowd. "Get some sleep. Come back in the morning. In the daylight in front of everyone, this town is going to decide what it is and what kind of people live in it." He looked at their faces. No more secrets. No more silence. Everything in the open where it belongs, where it should have been 8 years ago. Warren Cole stood in the main street of Silver Mesa with his hands bound and his pistol in the dirt, and the people of his town looking at him the way free people look at a man whose power over them has just become historical. He said nothing. He had nothing left to say. The long architecture of silence and fear and purchased authority that he had spent 20 years building had come down in a single night, and he was standing in the rubble of it with nowhere left to go except the cell at the end of the street. Caleb Stone put Warren Cole in his own jail cell and set 3 men he trusted at the door and went to sit on the courthouse steps until the sun came fully up over the mountains. He put his hand in his shirt pocket and found the horsehair bracelet. He had promised a child he would bring her mother home. The promise had been kept. He sat in the early morning light of Silver Mesa and felt the specific weight of a debt that was finally, after 8 years, on the correct side of the ledger. The day ahead was going to be long and hard and necessary. Warren Cole sat in his cell and thought about his powerful friends in Tucson, about whether they would arrive before the truth did. They would not. The truth was already here. By 9 in the morning, the square of Silver Mesa held nearly 100 people. They had come from the ranches and farms strung across the valley from places 10 and 15 miles distant, where the news had arrived sometime in the night and had not permitted further sleep. They came on horseback and in wagons and on foot in work clothes and Sunday clothes, and the clothes they had been wearing when word reached them, which meant some of them had ridden through the dark in what they slept in, which was its own kind of statement. They filled the square and overflowed onto the sidewalks and gathered on the steps of the buildings that faced it, and they stood in the way that people stand when they understand they are present at something that will define the story they tell about themselves and their town for the rest of their lives. George Lawson had brought a table from his store. It was the table he used for weighing goods and making change, a plain, working table without pretension or ceremony, scarred from years of use. He set it in the center of the square and stepped back from it and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who understands that the occasion is larger than the furniture and that this is appropriate. Warren Cole sat in a chair beside the marshal's office with his hands bound and his badge absent from his vest. He sat straight. His gray eyes moved over the gathering crowd with the continuous mechanical attention of a man cataloging threats, an old habit operating without purpose, the mind continuing processes that the situation has made irrelevant. He had not spoken since the previous night. He was not out of words from defeat. He was holding them, weighing when and whether they might still be useful. Judge Harold Stanton stood on the courthouse steps. He had not been bound. The formal process against him would take longer than a morning in a town square, and he occupied the difficult space between the accused and the free, visible to everyone, certain of nothing, his black suit impeccable, and his bearing the bearing of a man who has been looked at as an authority for 20 years and has not yet finished learning to be looked at as something else. Nathan Price stood 10 feet from Stanton and did not look away from him. Caleb stood near the table and watched the crowd settle into itself. He had not slept. He was aware of this as a condition rather than a complaint, his mind operating in the sharp-edged clarity that follows from a night of sustained necessity, everything too precise, the details of things unusually defined. Clara stood beside the table with the leather satchel in her hands, her injured shoulder bandaged properly now, with cloth from the women of the town who had come to Henry's ranch the previous evening, with clean linen and hot soup and the particular efficiency of a community that has decided to do something useful. Ruth Clearwater stood at the edge of the crowd, where the crowd met the open street, claiming no particular position but present in the way that she was always present, completely and without decoration. Webb held his Bible in the manner of working men who carry their tools available rather than displayed. Owen Fletcher stood near Cole. Henry Marsh climbed onto the wooden crate that had appeared beside the table. He was 70 years old and he had never sought ceremony. He used it now because the moment required it. "Friends and neighbors," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The square had gone quiet in the specific way that crowds go quiet when they understand that something real is about to be said. Not the performance of real, but the thing itself, the difference between which has nothing to do with volume. "We are here today because of a great wrong, a wrong done 8 years ago in this county by a man we chose to trust with our safety, a wrong too many people knew about, and too many people said nothing about, including me. I will carry my portion of that for whatever time I have left." No one in the square disputed this accounting. Robert Holt was a good man. He was a teacher and a father and a soldier who served this country honestly when honesty cost him everything. In October of 1871, his home burned and his wife died, and the man who ordered it told this county it was an accident. Most of us knew better. Almost none of us said so. That ends this morning. He looked out over the faces of people he had known for decades, ranchers and storekeepers and farmers and their families, ordinary people who had made the ordinary calculation of self-preservation and lived for 8 years with the specific discomfort of people who know they chose wrong. "Mrs. Holt, would you come forward?" Clara walked to the table. She wore a plain blue dress with a white collar that the women of the town had brought the previous evening, and she wore it with the unconscious dignity of a woman who had learned what dignity actually required, and it was not the dress. Her right hand held the leather satchel. Her left arm was held close to her body, the shoulder bound beneath the fabric. She climbed onto the crate beside the table and looked out at the people of Silver Mesa on a June morning, 8 years after they had let her family burn. She did not look at Cole. Not yet. "My name is Clara Holt," she said. Her voice was level and it carried without effort across the square to the buildings behind the crowd. "My father was Robert Holt. My mother was Eleanor Holt. 8 years ago, Marshal Warren Cole murdered them both." The sound that went through the crowd was not surprise. It was the sound of something said aloud for the first time that has been known silently for a long time, and the gap between those two conditions turned out to be large enough to produce an audible response from 100 people at once. She told the story from the beginning. She told it with the precision of a schoolteacher's daughter who had grown up watching a man organize information for the purpose of making it permanently understandable, not embellished and not abbreviated, her voice level and clear, and carrying the authority of someone who has rehearsed this moment in her mind for 8 years and has decided that the truth requires no decoration to be sufficient. In 1864, in the final year of the war, Warren Cole had commanded a detachment near a Union supply depot in the Western Territory. He burned the depot and killed 12 soldiers. He reported Confederate raiders. He buried $40,000 in stolen government gold and distributed the remainder in obligations that bought him years of protection. Robert Holt had been a contract clerk at that depot present by accident on the night of the fire, the only survivor, and he had survived it by accident by being in a place Cole had not thought to look. He had testified before a military tribunal. Cole had been dishonorably discharged. The case had been sealed. Cole had disappeared west and rebuilt himself as the law, because being the law was the most comprehensive form of protection available. She opened the satchel. The documents came out one by one. Each one held up its nature, explained its significance, made plain. The military court transcripts with the seals of the United States Army and the signatures of 3 officers, 2 now dead, and 1 still living in a territorial capital 400 miles away. The letters in Cole's own hand addressed to men in other counties whose functions were made clear by the content, the division of proceeds, and the management of the silence. The hand-drawn map copied by Robert Holt before testifying, marking the location of the buried gold with the specificity of a man who understood that the physical evidence was the anchor to which everything else had to be attached. She read one passage from one letter aloud. Cole's voice in his own hand, 20 years old and completely identifiable, discussing the disposal of men who might later become inconvenient. She read it without inflection because the words were sufficient without inflection. She set the letter down. And then she turned and looked directly at Warren Cole for the first time since the morning in Lawson's store, when she had been 20 years old and her belly was heavy with a child who had not yet been born. She looked at him for a long moment. "You killed my parents for nothing," she said. "You burned my family and drove me into the wilderness for 8 years with a child who had never done a single thing to you. You did all of that to suppress a truth that was always going to come out. You delayed it by 8 years. That is the sum of everything you have accomplished." Cole looked back at her. His face was controlled. It was so controlled, so absolutely empty of response to a woman who had just described the destruction of her family to 100 people, that the control itself became the most damning thing about him, more damning than any expression of guilt would have been. This was what he was, not a man who had done wrong things in a moment of weakness or passion, a man to whom other people's suffering had never registered as a morally relevant category. "Forgeries," he said, "old paper, a bitter woman's revenge on the man who enforced the law in this county. I have powerful friends in Tucson who will dismantle every word of this in a proper court." "Then explain this," Caleb said. He walked to the center of the square and held up a bronze medal on a ribbon. He turned it so the light caught the engraving on its reverse face, the letters pressed into the metal by a government that had believed when it made the medal that the man it was honoring had died in the service of something honorable. "Corporal William Turner, United States Army," Caleb read. "This medal was found 3 days ago in the ruins of the Holt House at Copper Creek, wedged in a gap between 2 burned foundation stones. A man carrying this medal was at that fire. A man carrying this medal lost it there." From somewhere in the back of the crowd, a sound began that was not a word, and then became one. It resolved into the sound of an old woman moving through the people between her and the center of the square. A woman of 72 years pushing forward with the purposeful unsteadiness of someone whose legs were not fully willing, but whose intention was absolute, and had been building for 15 years toward this specific moment. Margaret Turner had ridden 30 miles that morning after a rider reached her farm in the night with a message she had not entirely understood, but which had contained the words William Turner and Silver Mesa, and had been enough to get her out of bed and saddled before she had finished deciding whether to come. She had raised William's children after his death. She had been told he died in battle. She had been given a story of heroism and sacrifice, and she had built her grief on that foundation because it was the only foundation she had been offered, and she had been proud with the fierce and sustaining pride of an old woman who has lost much of how her grandson had died. She came through the crowd and stopped 5 feet from Warren Cole and looked at him. She was a small woman, Margaret Turner bent at the shoulders, her white hair pinned under a dark hat, her hands rough from decades of farm work. She was not impressive in any way that the word impressive is ordinarily used. She was the most powerful presence in the Silver Mesa Square on that June morning. William Turner was my grandson, she said. Her voice was thin and it did not waver. They told me he died fighting for his country. A hero. I have been proud of that for 15 years. His mother was proud. His children were proud. We built our lives around that pride because it was the only thing we had left of him. She looked at Cole with eyes that had been doing a certain kind of arithmetic since they arrived. You let us grieve a lie. You let us be proud of a lie. You took his real death and hid it and gave us a false one in its place, and you let his mother and his children and his grandmother grow old, believing that false thing. She stopped. I am standing here today because I am the last one left alive who remembers him. His mother is gone. His children are grown and far away, and I have not told them yet. She was quiet for a moment. What am I supposed to tell them? Warren Cole said nothing. The silence that Cole returned to Margaret Turner's question was the silence of a man who had never in 60 years considered that question to be one that required his attention and could not begin now. George Lawson stepped forward from the crowd. He was carrying documents that Nathan Price had delivered to him the previous evening, a letter from Cole to Stanton. Cole's own hand on the page dated 1876, discussing the arrangement between them in language that had been intended as euphemism, and that read in a public square in the full light of a June morning is nothing more and nothing less than a confession. Lawson unfolded the papers on the table and read from them in a voice that gained steadiness as it went, like a man discovering in the process of doing something difficult that he is capable of it. The figures were specific. The dates were specific. The purposes were named. The arrangement between a marshal and a judge, 20 years of corruption, built into the architecture of the law itself, stated in the hand of the man who had designed and maintained it. Nathan Price walked to the table. He was 25 years old, and he looked older, not from age, but from the wear of someone who has spent 3 years doing things he knew were wrong and has not been able to stop thinking about them since. He had ridden for Cole since he was 22. He had been present at the burning of the Holt house when he was 22 years old, and he had believed what he had been told about Robert Holt, and he had stood in the dark and watched a house burn, and he had spent the 3 years since in the specific waking nightmare of someone who cannot undo a thing and cannot stop seeing it. He placed his hand flat on the table. My name is Nathan Price, he said. I was present at the burning of the Holt house in October of 1871. I was 22 years old. I was told Robert Holt was a traitor, a man who had sold information to Confederate sympathizers, a man too dangerous for the ordinary law. I believed this because I wanted to belong to something, and because I was afraid, and because Cole was very convincing, and because I was 22. He looked at his hand on the table. I am not offering these as justifications. They are explanations of a thing that does not ultimately have a justification. He raised his eyes to Clara. I helped pour the kerosene. I helped light the fire. When Eleanor Holt called out from inside the house, I stood where I was, and I did not move. He stopped for a moment. I have stood in that place in my mind every night since. I am done standing there. A man in the crowd lunged forward with a sound that was grief made physical. 2 men held him back. His face was the face of someone for whom this was not history but personal, and Nathan Price looked at him and did not look away. You will stand trial, Henry said from his position near the table. You understand that? Yes, sir. All 3 of you, Cole, Stanton, you. The trial will be conducted by the territorial law. Fair, honest, and completely independent of the influence that has corrupted law in this county for 20 years. Henry looked at the crowd and then at Cole. That is the difference between what is happening here today and what has been happening here for 20 years. That difference is everything. Cole raised his head. You have nothing that will hold in a real court, he said. He did not raise his voice. He said it the way a man states a professional assessment, factual and certain. I have lawyers in Tucson who have handled worse than this. I have friends in the territorial government who will call every one of these documents into question. I have spent 20 years building exactly this kind of protection, and it does not collapse because a few scared people had a bad night. He looked out over the square. And every person in this square should understand that I remember faces. Every one of you who has stood here today and said nothing will have that choice come back to you. And every one of you who has spoken will find that I have a long memory and considerable resources and a great deal of time. The threat was real. Everyone in the Silver Mesa Square knew it was real. The people standing there that morning had spent 8 years living inside the reality of that threat, accommodating themselves to it, making the small daily adjustments of posture and speech and avoidance that a community makes when it has accepted that certain things cannot be said and certain questions cannot be asked. The threat was real, and it landed in the square, and what happened to it was what happens to a fire that runs out of material. Nothing. Owen Fletcher said from his position near Cole's chair, in the tone of someone completing a ledger entry, "We sent riders to Tucson 2 days ago with copies of every document in that satchel. Copies are in 3 locations. The territorial governor's office received them this morning." He looked at Cole without any particular expression. "Your friends in Tucson know the evidence exists and know it is in too many hands to suppress. Your lawyers will have a great deal of genuine work to do, and I wish them the best of luck with it." Cole looked at Owen Fletcher. He looked at Caleb Stone and Henry Marsh and Reverend Webb and Ruth Clearwater and Nathan Price and the 100 people standing in the square in the morning light of a June day in Silver Mesa, all of them looking back at him without the particular quality he had relied on for 40 years. He understood what had happened. He had built his power on silence. The silence was over. What followed from that was simply mathematics. Before George Lawson could move toward Cole to take the badge, a small voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. "Mama." The crowd opened. Lily Holt walked through the space that formed around her, her hand in Nathan Price's hand, the young man who had confessed his crime, having apparently decided in the hours since his testimony that there was one more thing he could do that might matter. She wore her blue dress washed and dried in the night. Her hair was combed. Her feet were bare on the dust of the Silver Mesa Square, and she walked across it with the deliberate care of someone who has learned that careful steps are better than no steps and better than reckless ones. Clara came off the crate. She crossed the space between herself and her daughter, the way water comes off a height entirely and at once, and she was on her knees with Lily in her arms before the child had finished the last few steps, and they came together in the middle of the square with the specific completeness of 2 people for whom the space between them had been the defining wound of their lives for 8 years. Neither of them spoke. Lily pulled back after a long moment and looked at her mother's face with both hands, her small palms on Clara's cheeks, confirming through touch what sight had established. "Mama, you came back. I promised you I would. You always keep your promises. Always." Lily stood up. She looked at her mother. She looked at the crowd. Then she walked to the wooden crate beside the table and climbed onto it, and someone, without being asked, brought the smaller crate and placed it on top of the first so that an 8-year-old girl could stand at the height of the morning and be seen. The silence that came down over Silver Mesa Square in the following seconds was the most complete silence Caleb had ever heard in a place with 100 people in it. "My name is Lily Holt," she said. Her voice was clear. It was the voice of a child who had been spoken to her entire life as an intelligent person by a mother who believed that the way you talk to children is the way you teach them to talk to the world. It was also the voice of a child who had learned in 8 years of necessity that every word she spoke carried the full weight she gave it and nothing else. "I am 8 years old. I never met my grandfather or my grandmother. My mama told me about them. She said my grandfather taught school and that the thing he loved most in the world was watching someone understand something they hadn't understood before. She said my grandmother made the best bread in the territory and that she laughed easily and often and that she made the people around her feel like the world was a reasonable place to live. She said they would have loved me." In the crowd, an old woman's shoulders moved without sound. "My mom and I have been hiding for my whole life because the man sitting in that chair ordered my grandparents' deaths and then came after us to make sure the truth about it died too. I grew up learning things children are not supposed to have to learn. How to stay hidden, how to move without noise, how to check the wind for the smell of horses, how to read shadows to count the hours of walking light, how to ration water to the hour in summer heat. She paused not from uncertainty, but from the rhythm of someone who has learned to give her words the space to settle. I don't say this to make you feel sorry for me. I had a mother who loved me and taught me everything she knew and kept me safe through all of it. I say it so you understand what was taken from this family. Not just my grandfather and grandmother. 8 years of an ordinary life. My mama had to be afraid every day. I had to be afraid every day. My grandfather died so we wouldn't have to be afraid. He believed that somewhere there was someone who would do the right thing. We spent 8 years in the wilderness waiting for that person. She turned her pale blue eyes to the man in the chair. She looked at Warren Cole the way you look at something you have understood completely and are no longer afraid of. The look that comes after fear, not before it. The look that requires the full journey through fear to arrive at. You killed good people because you were afraid of the truth. My grandfather was not afraid of the truth. My mama was not afraid of the truth. Biscuit ran until his legs gave out because he was not afraid of what came next. I sat in the shade of a dead horse in 95 degrees for 3 days because I was not afraid of what came next either. She looked at him for another steady moment. You have spent your whole life being afraid of one man telling the truth, and all the killing and hiding and burning in the world could not stop it from getting here. She turned to the crowd. I want justice, not revenge. Revenge does not give me my grandfather or my grandmother or the years my mama spent afraid in the dark. Nothing gives us those things back. Justice means that when you do wrong, you face what you have done in front of the people you wronged, and you answer for it honestly. That is what my grandfather believed. He died for it. I believe it too. And I think most of the people in this square believe it, even the ones who were too afraid to say so before today. She looked at the ordinary faces of the ordinary people of Silver Mesa. My grandpa trusted that somewhere there was someone who would do the right thing. He was right. Mr. Caleb Stone did the right thing. Mr. Henry Marsh did the right thing. Mr. Owen Fletcher and Reverend Haryeb and Ruth Clearwater and Mr. Nathan Price all did the right thing. Some of them did it late. Some of them had to go through their fear first. That is all right. That is what courage actually is. It is not the absence of fear. It is doing the right thing on the other side of it. She climbed down from the crate and walked to her mother and stood beside her, and Clara put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. George Lawson needed a moment before he could speak. He was not the only one. He walked to Warren Cole and unpinned the marshal's badge from Cole's vest and held it in his palm for a moment. The metal was warm from the morning sun. He looked at it without expression. Then he placed it on the table beside Robert Holt's letter, beside the military transcripts and the hand-drawn map and the letter from Cole to Stanton, and all the accumulated evidence of 40 years of crimes committed by a man who had kept the badge that should have stopped him. Warren Cole, Lawson said, by the authority of the Silver Mesa Town Council and the people of this county, you are stripped of your office and your badge. You will be transported to the territorial capital in Tucson to stand trial for murder, for theft of government funds, for corruption of public office, and for crimes against the government and people of the United States. The evidence of your guilt has been secured in multiple locations and is beyond your ability to suppress or destroy. This is the end of your authority in this county and in this territory. He looked at Stanton on the courthouse steps. Judge Harold Stanton, the evidence against you has been forwarded to the territorial governor's office and to the federal circuit court. You are under citizen's arrest pending formal proceedings. I would recommend you not test the patience of the people standing in this square by attempting to leave. Stanton looked at Nathan Price, the young man who had ridden for Cole for 3 years and had kept a letter for 2 years, waiting for a moment when producing it would mean something. Looked back at the judge with the steady attention of someone who has decided what he is and is done negotiating with a decision. Stanton sat down on the courthouse steps and placed his hands on his knees and looked at the ground between his feet. Cole said with a precision and coldness that made several people near him step back, "You have not heard the last of me, not one of you." He said it to all of them, but he looked at Lily when he said it. Caleb moved to stand between Cole and Lily before the sentence was finished. He stood there and looked at Warren Cole from 4 feet away, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the standing there did not say more clearly. Cole looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he looked away. The people of Silver Mesa watched Warren Cole being led to his own jail cell, and they watched Judge Harold Stanton sit on the courthouse steps with his hands on his knees, and they stood in the square in the morning light and began individually and in small groups and with the specific awkwardness of people who have been carrying something for a long time and are setting it down for the first time to understand what it felt like. It felt like something that should have happened a long time ago. It felt like the thing they had owed Robert and Eleanor Holt for 8 years. It felt finally like justice. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived at Henry Marsh's ranch bearing the seal of the territorial governor's office. Henry brought it in person to the small house on the edge of Silver Mesa, where Clara and Lily had moved 3 weeks prior. 2 rooms and a fireplace, and a south window looking toward the mountains rented from George Lawson at a price that constituted a statement of intent rather than a commercial transaction. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with Lily leaning against her arm, both of them reading together the way they had read everything together for 8 years, the habit of 2 people for whom books and letters and the written word had been the most reliable form of company available. The letter contained 3 distinct sections. The first confirmed that Warren Cole's trial had been scheduled for the following spring and that the prosecuting attorney for the territory had described the evidence as the clearest case of premeditated murder and sustained corruption of public office he had encountered in 20 years of practice. Cole's lawyers in Tucson had entered their appearance and had then spent 2 weeks reviewing the evidence and had apparently spent a third week arriving at a private assessment that the situation was more consequential than their client had represented it to be. The second confirmed that Judge Harold Stanton had been removed from the bench pending federal investigation and that every case decided in his court over the preceding 20 years was subject to review. The territorial courts had already identified 14 cases whose outcomes bore the specific signature of Cole and Stanton's arrangement. 14 families, 14 versions of the same betrayal, 14 debts that the territory was only beginning to understand it owed. The third section was in a different hand added below the official text in the slanting script of a man writing in the margins of his own document because what he needed to say did not fit into the official language. The territory of Arizona owes this family a debt that no formal document can repay. Your father acted with a courage that this government failed to honor and failed to protect. The attached order restores formally and permanently to the public record the honor and reputation of Robert Holt and Eleanor Holt, citizens of this territory, who died in the service of truth at the hands of a man we should have stopped years before we did. A memorial will be erected at Copper Creek at territorial expense. We begin here understanding that beginning is not the same as finishing, and that finishing is not something we are likely to achieve in any reasonable accounting of what was owed. We can only start. Jan. Clara folded the letter with careful hands and set it on the table. Lily looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at her mother. Grandpa gets to be who he really was, she said, in writing, permanently, for everyone to see. Yes, that is all he ever wanted, not to win, not to be important, just to be believed. Clara looked at her daughter for a long time. 8 years old and already in clear possession of the thing her grandfather had spent his life trying to teach, and her mother had spent 8 years in the wilderness learning the hard way. She pulled Lily close and held her without speaking, and held her for a long time. Caleb Stone came to the house every evening. He came without announcement and stayed without overstaying. Arriving around sunset and sitting on the porch with his knife and a piece of wood, he was working into a shape that revealed itself gradually over the weeks. Unhurriedly, the way things that are being made correctly reveal themselves. He did not impose the evenings. He filled them with his presence, which was different, and the difference was something that the 3 of them had apparently all assessed and found agreeable without discussing it, because none of them discussed it, which was itself a form of discussion. He was working something out. Clara knew this because she was working out the same thing from the other direction, which is the way that people who are right for each other tend to approach the same problem from different positions and with different tools and arriving at the same place by different routes. One evening when Lily had gone inside to feed the small dog Henry had given her for reasons Henry described as practical and that were transparently nothing of the kind, Clara sat on the porch in the blue quiet of the Arizona evening and said his name. Caleb. He set down his knife in the piece of wood, looked at her. After all of this, she said, after everything, is there something you have been wanting to ask me? He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has too much to say and is determining the right entry point. I want to do it right, he said, the right way, in the right place. Then do it right, in the right place. He stood up and held out his hand. They walked through Silver Mesa in the last light of the evening, through the town that had changed around them in the weeks since the morning in the square, a change not of buildings or geography, but of the quality of the air. The particular change that happens in a place when a pressure that has been building for years is finally released, and the thing that fills the space is different from the thing that had been there. They walked to the cemetery behind the church, the new church built in the months since by hands that had previously found reasons not to build at the church above, whose door someone had carved in letters large enough to be read from the road, the words that Robert Holt had written in the last letter he ever sent. The truth endures. Under the cottonwood at the eastern edge of the cemetery, two headstones stood side by side. The territorial governor's order had been specific and swift. The stones to be cut from the same granite, the names to be carved in the same letters, the inscription identical. Robert Holt, Eleanor Holt, beloved. The truth endures. Caleb knelt in front of them. Clara stood behind him and pressed her hand against her mouth and watched. Mr. Holt, Caleb said. He used the voice underneath all his managed voices, the voice that had nowhere left to go except toward the truth. Mrs. Holt, I was in this county the night your house burned. I knew something was coming, and I did not act. I was 27 years old, and I was afraid, and I had a father telling me it was not my business, and I chose to believe him because believing him was easier than what the alternative required. He paused. There is no version of that I can make better than what it was. It was cowardice. The consequences of that cowardice fell on your family and not on me, which is the specific nature of the thing I did wrong. He reached into his vest pocket and brought out a small box, and inside the box was a gold ring, worn smooth from years of being on a woman's hand, his mother's ring carried since her death, with the intention of passing it forward when the right moment arrived. I cannot undo what I failed to do. What I can tell you is what I have done since, and what I am asking your permission to do going forward. I found your granddaughter dying in the desert, and I kept my word to her. I found your daughter and brought her back from Devil's Ridge. And now I am asking your permission to marry her and to be the nearest thing to a father that your granddaughter will have, who is the most remarkable 8-year-old person I have ever encountered, and who is very clearly your granddaughter in the most complete sense of that phrase. He was quiet for a moment. I cannot promise perfection. I can promise honesty and presence and the full effort of whatever time I have left trying to be worthy of them both. That is the only real promise a man can make, not the ones made in good moments, the ones kept in hard ones. From the shadow of the cottonwood at the edge of the cemetery, a small voice said, "Is this the part where you ask her?" Clara turned. Lily stood at the edge of the grass with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who has been listening long enough to have formed a considered opinion about the pacing of events. "How long have you been standing there?" Clara managed. "Long enough." Lily tilted her head. "Are you going to say yes, or are we going to stand here all night? I'm cold." Caleb looked up at Clara from where he was still kneeling in front of her parents' graves, the ring in his open palm, and his face had on it the expression of a man who has just been rescued from solemnity at precisely the right moment by precisely the right person. "Well," he said. Clara looked at him. She looked at the headstones of her parents behind him, their names in granite, their truth finally restored to the permanent record. She looked at her daughter standing under the cottonwood with her arms crossed and the pale blue eyes of Robert Holt, observing the situation with characteristic precision and zero patience for unnecessary delay. "Yes," she said. "Yes, as soon as Reverend Webb can arrange it. Not someday, soon." Lily uncrossed her arms and nodded once satisfied in the manner of someone whose assessment of the situation has been confirmed by events and who considers the matter settled. The wedding took place on the last Saturday of February, on a morning that came in cold and then warmed quickly in the way of Arizona winter mornings, the sun finding the valley and filling it with the particular clear light of a cold February in the high country. The church was full before 9 o'clock. The overflow stood in the yard with their breath visible in the morning air, and their faces in the expression of people attending an occasion they had been waiting for longer than the people most directly involved had been aware of it. Henry Marsh walked Clara down the aisle. He had dressed with an attention to detail that revealed the significance he assigned to the occasion, and his white hair was combed, and his old dark coat still fit him, the way it had always fit him, and his eyes were bright in the manner of eyes that have earned the right to brightness. Owen Fletcher stood beside Caleb at the front of the church. He had not said much about any of it in the months leading to this morning, which was consistent with his general approach to everything that mattered, and which communicated more clearly than an extended speech would have done that he was exactly where he wanted to be. Ruth Clearwater sat in the front pew in a dress that the women of the town had made for her, dark blue cotton, simple and well-made, and she wore it with the dignity of someone for whom ceremony was not a foreign language, but a different dialect of the one she already spoke. She had stayed in Silver Mesa through the week since the reckoning in the square. She had not explained this decision beyond what she had already said, which was sufficient, and no one had pressed her to explain further. The town had begun the process, uncertain and imperfect, as all such processes are, of understanding what it owed Ruth Clearwater and her people, and the long list of those for whom no amends would ever be adequate. It was a beginning. Ruth knew the difference between a beginning and a conclusion, and she was staying for now to see whether the beginning continued. Lily stood beside her mother in a white dress assembled by the women of the town with considerable collective investment of material and opinion, resulting in a garment that represented a community's vision of what a little girl at her mother's wedding should look like. She stood straight and held Clara's hand and watched Reverend Webb conduct the ceremony with the expression of someone monitoring a process for proper execution. Webb read from Corinthians, "Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love endures all things." He asked if anyone present had cause to object. The silence that filled the church in response was the most complete silence Caleb had ever experienced in a room full of people, and he had been in rooms full of people for 35 years. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, and by the God in whom I have maintained my faith through 40 years of evidence, both for and against, I pronounce you husband and wife." Lily wrapped both arms around both of them before the sentence was entirely finished, which required some accommodation, but which everyone present agreed was the appropriate conclusion. That evening after the celebration, and the last of the guests had made their way home through the February dark, Henry Marsh and Owen Fletcher, and Reverend Webb and Ruth Clearwater sat together on the porch of Henry's ranch with their coffee and the stars overhead, and very little need to speak. They had done something difficult together, and they were now sitting in the specific peace that follows from that, the peace that is not emptiness, but fullness, the peace of people who have used themselves for something worth being used for. Henry raised his cup. "To Robert and Eleanor Holt," he said, "who trusted that the right people existed and would eventually show up." 4 cups met in the dark. 5 years passed. They pass the way years pass when they are full of the right things too quickly in retrospect, and with sufficient weight in the living of them to leave a mark that does not fade. Clara's school filled in its first week and expanded twice in the years that followed. She taught reading and arithmetic, but she also taught by the example of having survived 8 years in the wilderness, and by explicit instruction that the truth was worth protecting, even when protection was expensive and the outcome was uncertain. Caleb worked Henry's land alongside the old man for 2 years. When Henry died quietly in his sleep in the summer of 1882, apparently having concluded that his work was finished and his rest was warranted, Caleb continued the work that Henry had established, because that is what you do with good work when it is left in your hands. He and Clara had 2 more children. A boy they named Daniel for the grandfather who had not lived to see him. A girl they named Hope for 2 words pressed into copper by a woman on a ridge in the Arizona wilderness who needed her daughter to know the most important thing. Warren Cole died in the territorial prison at Yuma in 1882 in a card game that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with the ordinary consequences of being the kind of man he had always been. The news reached Silver Mesa in a dispatch and was noted without ceremony, because the ending of Warren Cole was not the story. The story was what his ending made possible. Judge Harold Stanton died of a heart attack while awaiting trial. Some people found this anticlimactic. Others found it appropriate, the body producing its own verdict before the court could reach theirs. Nathan Price served 2 years and was released on the basis of his cooperation and the testimony of Clara Holt, who appeared at his hearing and said that the truth had needed him and he had delivered it, and that this mattered. He was elected sheriff of Silver Mesa in 1884 and served for 12 years, during which time the county developed a reputation for the kind of law enforcement that comes from a man who has examined the alternative and concluded he will not be that again. In September of 1885, the family sat on the porch of their ranch house in the early evening, quiet, the mountains going blue in the east and the sky overhead going from gold to amber to the first pale stars. Clara in her rocking chair, Caleb with his knife and a piece of wood that was slowly becoming something. Daniel chasing the dog across the yard with the complete commitment of a 3-year-old in pursuit of something faster than himself. Hope asleep against Clara's shoulder, and Lily, 14 years old, sitting on the porch rail with a letter in her hands that she had been reading since it arrived that afternoon, each reading producing a slightly different expression. The letter was from the Phoenix Girls Academy. It offered a full scholarship, tuition and board, and all fees beginning in the fall term. She looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. "You need to go," he said. "You are all here. Your grandfather died so you could have choices. Your grandmother died so you could be free. Your mother spent 8 years in the wilderness so you could have a future that was not defined by hiding." He set down his wood. "That future is not supposed to look like staying close to home out of gratitude. Gratitude is not what any of them were buying. What if I fail? Then you fail. Then you get up. Then you try again. That is not a disaster. That is a life." He looked at her directly. "You stood on a wooden crate in the middle of Silver Mesa when you were 8 years old and told the truth to 100 people, and you did not flinch once. You are not a person who fails because she is afraid." Lily looked at her mother. Clara looked at her daughter, this 14-year-old girl with her grandfather's eyes and her mother's jaw and the specific quality of character that is produced by necessity and love in equal measure. And she said the only thing that needed to be said: "I think you should soar." The train station in Tucson on a cool September morning, the locomotive waiting with its controlled impatience, steam rising in the early air. The platform busy with ordinary departures and arrivals, the ordinary business of lives moving between places. Lily stood at the door of her car with a bag of books and the posture of someone moving towards something rather than away. Owen Fletcher was there, and Ruth Clearwater was there, and Reverend Webb was there, and Caleb and Clara stood together on the platform with Daniel between them and Hope in Clara's arms. Henry was gone by then, but he was present anyway, in the way that people who have done important things in your life continue to be present after they are gone, in the habits, in the values, and the decisions they help shape. Ruth placed her hand on Lily's shoulder for a moment before the boarding call. She said nothing. The hand said what the words would have said, which was that she had watched this child from a cave on a ridge when the child was small and frightened and alone, and that she had watched what the child had become, and that she was satisfied with what she had helped preserve. Owen nodded once. This was Owen's version of a speech, and everyone on the platform understood it as such. The whistle blew. Lily hugged her mother with the fierceness of someone who understands that the strength of an embrace is one of the few ways we have of telling a person what they mean to us when words are not sufficient. She hugged Caleb the same way, without reservation, and he stood there with his arms around this child he had found dying in the desert, and felt in his chest the thing he had felt first the morning he rode toward a dead horse, and a small voice said, "Are you going to help me or not?" It was the answer to that question. It had been the answer all along. "Right, every week," Clara said. "Every week, I promise." She climbed aboard. She stood at the window as the train began to move, watching the platform recede, the faces getting smaller. Her mother's hand raised in the morning air. She watched until the platform was gone, and there was only the track in the desert and the mountains turning in the peony arc of departure. And then she turned away from the window and sat with her bag of books in her lap and looked at the country moving past. She thought about her grandfather, the man she had never met but had known her whole life through the stories her mother told. The man who had stood before a military tribunal and given his testimony against a powerful man because the truth was there to be told, and he was the one who had to tell it. The man who had written in his last letter on the night before men came to kill him that the truth does not die, that it waits, that it endures in people, in the succession of people who carry it forward from one generation to the next. He had been right, not because he was optimistic, because he was accurate. He had been a man who knew human beings at their best well enough to know that their best was real, and he had trusted that it would arrive. It had arrived late, it had cost more than it should have cost, but it had arrived. She would use what he had given her. She would fight for the people who could not fight for themselves. She would carry forward what her grandfather had started and her mother had preserved, and Caleb Stone had recovered on a June morning when he could have ridden past a dead horse and had not. She pressed her palm to the cool glass of the window. She made herself a promise in the wordless way that the most important promises are made not spoken but committed to, in a place deeper than speech, in the place where character lives before it becomes action. She would be worthy of the people who had kept the truth alive for her to inherit. On the platform in Tucson, the train had become a thread of smoke against the morning sky. Clara watched it until it was gone, Caleb's arm around her shoulders, Daniel pulling at his coat, hope making small, urgent sounds against her chest. She is going to be extraordinary, Caleb said. She already is. She has been extraordinary since the day she was born in a cave because her mother was too stubborn to stop moving. You weren't stubborn. You were surviving. Same thing some days. Not the same thing, he said. Surviving is what you do when you have no choice. What you did required something else. Clara was quiet for a moment in the way of someone weighing a statement against 8 years of experience with it. My father wrote that the truth endures, she said, that it waits. I used to think he meant the documents, the physical evidence hidden in the church floor. She looked at the sky where the smoke had been. But I think he meant people. The truth endures because people decide to carry it, even when it costs them everything, even when they are alone and afraid and cannot see from one day to the next whether what they are doing will matter. And sometimes, Caleb said, it endures because a man who hasn't slept properly in 8 years decides one morning to ride toward a dead horse instead of around it. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, unmanaged and unguarded, the kind she had been learning back slowly over the year. The laugh of a woman who has stopped saving her ease for when things were certain, because certainty was never the condition under which she had been required to live. They walked together toward the horses in the road home. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Caleb stood on the porch of their ranch and looked at the stars. The same stars that had been overhead on the night 4 men sat around a kitchen table and placed their hands on top of each other's in the lamplight and decided they were going to do the right thing regardless of the cost. The same stars that had been overhead on the night of the fire. The same stars that had looked down on 8 years of hiding and 8 years of guilt and 8 years of a truth waiting in the dark for someone to come and claim it. They looked different tonight, not because they had changed, because he had. He reached into his shirt pocket and found the horsehair bracelet, the one Lily had given him in the flat beside a dead horse, and that he had returned to her, and that she had pressed back into his hands at the Tucson station that morning, saying only that she was going where she needed to go and did not need to carry it anymore because she had already learned what it said. He turned it in his fingers. The 2 words on the copper plates pressed deep and clear. Hope lives. He had been 35 years old when he found a dying child beside a dead horse and made a decision that was either very late or exactly on time, depending on which end of the story you stood at. He was 41 now. He had a wife who had survived 8 years in the wilderness and come out of it with her character intact and her father's clarity of mind. He had a daughter boarding trains to schools that would make something of the extraordinary material she already was. He had 2 children asleep inside a house he had built on land he had earned by finally doing what he should have done when he was 27 years old and chose not to. He had not built this. He had been given the pieces of it when a child said, "Are you going to help me or not?" He put the bracelet back in his pocket. He thought about Robert Holt writing by lamplight on the last night of his life, the men coming in the morning, and the letter going down on paper anyway because he understood that the act of writing it was its own form of survival, that the truth committed to paper had a life independent of the man who wrote it, that it would wait in the dark for whoever was coming, and that whoever was coming would use it. He had been right about that. He had been right about everything. Clara appeared in the doorway behind him. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Your father." Whether he knew when he wrote that letter that it would take 8 years, he would have written it exactly the same, Clara said without needing to consider it, because the length of time was never the point. The point was that the truth was there, and he was the one who had to tell it. So he told it. She came out and stood beside him. He put his arm around her. Above them, the Arizona stars burned in their ancient, unconcerned abundance, indifferent to human drama, in the way that only things of genuine permanence can be their light-crossing distances that dwarfed everything below them. Everything except perhaps the stubborn, human insistence on meaning, on consequence, on the idea that what a person does in the dark matters in the light. The truth endures. It had always been that simple, that hard, that worth fighting for. They stood together under the stars until the cold of the desert night came fully in, and then they went inside to their children, in their fire, and the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built from broken pieces and courage, and the long-delayed decision of one man to ride towards something instead of around it. The debt had been paid. The legacy had begun.